Welcome back to another podcast episode where we help aspiring developers get jobs and junior developers grow. Today, we're going to be diving into what it's like to work at Google. And we're going to be talking to June, who is currently a software engineer at Google, and Jeremy, who was a software engineer at Google. And they're kind of going to share their experiences. We're going to dive into maybe some of the perks and rumors you might have heard with Google, but more or less, we're going to learn the day-to-day and what it's been like for them working there. So we're going to start with the intros. Jeremy, you want to give us a quick little intro, who you are? You're muted.
Oh, I am muted. Sorry about that.
No
hey, I'm Jeremy. I'm currently a principal engineer at a company called GoHealth that's based in Chicago, but I actually work out of North Carolina. And I was employed at Google for going on 7 years at the time, but that was, I don't even know how many years ago now. Close to 7 again, or 6. Yeah, there we go, 6. So yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Jeremy. How about you, June?
Yeah, I'm June. I'm currently a software engineer at Google. I work on the front end side of things at the Google Workspace products. Before that, I was a software engineer at Grubhub here in Chicago. My current team is based in Sunnyvale, so near Google headquarters, but still based in Chicago myself due to remote. I guess one last thing I should say for my intro is that disclaimer, obligatory. Anything I say here today is my own opinion and do not represent the company.
Absolutely. I'm glad you said that too, June. Thank you. Especially with a company like or as big as Google. So I brought both of you on. And Jeremy, we had mentioned this earlier, but you had worked at Google a long time ago, but you had worked there many, many years. And so I think it's going to be very interesting hearing your perspective for that long and hearing June's current experience and kind of comparing those two. And we can really see how far Google has come and what it's become, which I think is really interesting. So let's dive into it. Either of you, feel free to, answer if you have something to say right away. But thinking about kind of like how much time you spend with meetings, code reviews, actual coding, and any of your other day-to-day activities at Google, what's your average day look like, or what has it looked like?
I guess I'll go first. When I was there, I was actually on the open source team for a little while before they shut that down. And then I transitioned to the GWIS team, which is basically the Google web server. It serves the front page. And my day didn't have a lot of meetings, actually. Like I could go almost a week sometimes without having a meeting. Most of my time was spent probably about 50-50 coding and code reviews at the time. And like talking around someone's desk about a particular problem that we were trying to, figure out. So that was my day for the most part. Very, very low process, very low bureaucracy.
Yeah, I guess from my end, the most unique part would be that I started at Google after kind of they moved entirely to work from home. So I actually have never worked with my team in the office. And so that does change my day-to-day quite a bit than a typical, Google engineer would. But in terms of the tasks done, it's still similar. I'm still pretty junior, so definitely more focused on implementation and code writing and doing research for writing code than reviewing, but there's still a good amount of reviewing in there. I would say day to day, bunch of meetings to make sure our team is always synced on whatever we're working on. Sometimes meetings that, are about more, all hands kind of style, just from top down. But really, really a good variety of things. I would say my day probably still hasn't stabilized to a typical day-to-day, as you would call it, because I'm still learning a lot of things as I go. But it's a good variety of writing code, reviewing code, learning new tools, new frameworks, looking up documentation, asking teammates and jumping on calls with them, asking questions. So all kinds of stuff.
Cool. So you kind of compared this idea of what your day-to-day is going to look like past kind of your junior phase versus what you're doing now. How do you expect it to change maybe within a year?
Yeah, I guess there's kind of two parts. So the first part is like junior as in, position in terms of if I were to grow. So maybe like even beyond a year. And so typically, if you're familiar with like a typical software engineer at a big company, as you go up the ladder, the less coding you end up actually doing yourself. And that's kind of the same here. As if I were to progress more to senior levels, I would be probably doing more planning, doing more document writing than perhaps writing implementation myself. But in terms of like onboarding and ramping up, I hope to spend less time in 6 months to a year. I hope to spend less time reading documentation and pinging my teammates for help, and spending more time, actually writing code or reviewing others' code, and still, continuing to learn as you always should, but doing more impactful stuff alongside that learning.
Okay.
Yeah, we used to have a saying when I was there. When you start at Google, they don't expect you to be productive for the first 6 months. I think part of that's because Google has a very extreme case of not invented here syndrome.
Yeah.
And so there's like everything's new. It's all different. It's all like not standard compared to the rest of the world. That may be changing a little bit now with things like Kubernetes, where like they're doing something similar internally as they're shipping externally. But when I was there, like we weren't shipping most of that stuff externally. And so, you spent the first few months just figuring out how everything worked.
Yeah, and I guess this kind of goes to answer Don's question a little bit about what's changed, and that part specifically has not changed at all. And really, like, one of the biggest, shocks to me was comparing my previous job's onboarding experience to my current Google onboarding experience, because my previous job, I was like a React engineer. I already kind of knew React going in, and I was really able to like hit the ground running and get production code out there, within a matter of a week or two. Whereas, here, like my manager, many people telling me like, oh, it's just like, you're going to be feeling like you're ramping up for the first 6 months. It's like, it takes a long time. And it's really true. Like everything here is like in-house, so to speak. Like everything is kind of, built to fit Google. And of course, it's a double-edged sword in many ways. And sometimes that's great because, it means all the infrastructure is so like well integrated and whatnot, and the tooling is all there for you, and you can just kind of read it and do it since somebody's already done it. But on the other hand, it means like you can't take advantage of like the bigger communities, resources, like as compared to something like React. The documentation may or may not be good depending on what product you're working on, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it's definitely something different.
Interesting. And I just have a question. What is not invented here syndrome? I've never heard of that.
Basically means not using it unless you did it in-house.
Okay.
So no off the shelf. Google was notorious for it internally when I was there. Like there'd be a thing that would do whatever you wanted, but Google would be like, we can do better. And to be fair, like most of the times they literally could do better. One of the things I missed the most when I left was the engineering tooling. Like I think Google at the time, and probably still does, have best in class engineering tooling and invest more in that than maybe any other company.
It's really good. Yeah.
You guys are making me kind of jealous. That sounds really good. It sounds like it would have been convenient in many cases. Okay, so what I want to actually dive into now is kind of just I want to see how valuable this is going to be for other people, but just a few interesting perks and different things that I've heard about Google. Maybe both of you can help correct me or kind of elaborate on some of these things. But when I quickly, and by the way, for anyone listening, they didn't prepare any of these answers. So kudos to them for just making it on the spot, because I gave them all of these questions 5 minutes before we started this. So, but anyways, with that context in mind, I had heard that, actually, I'd heard a lot of Googlers kind of complain that they had to spend too much time interviewing prospect employees. And maybe, some people would enjoy that. Maybe some people just want to code. Everyone's going to be different. But is that true? Did both of you spend a lot of time interviewing, or at least being part of interviews and giving your feedback for prospect employees?
I did spend a fair amount of time interviewing. I didn't think it was burdensome. I had the freedom to decrease the amount if I needed to. I will say that actually proved to be one of the more valuable things, among many valuable things that I learned at Google, was how to conduct a good interview, and how to give good interview feedback for people to make a hiring decision on. I've used it at every place I've been since.
Yeah, I guess from my perspective, I've still yet to hit my 6-month mark here quite. So I haven't really been exposed to any of the hiring process from the other side. That said, I was pretty heavily involved with the college recruiting in my previous position as a software engineer, but that was really on my own accord, and kind of reached out to the recruiting team to kind of help with that on my own accord. So I imagine, if Google, whenever they decided that it's appropriate for me to do that, I'd jump on board and help as well. But, in terms of like my teammates, I haven't heard anybody talk much about any issues with that.
Okay. It does sound like it is a thing, though, among software engineers, which can be very different depending on the company. So it's interesting to hear. Personally, I would love learning about that. I think it's really, really valuable. I love that idea. But okay, what's your favorite perk working with Google?
Ooh, this is a tough one. I've never been in the office I've visited, but I've never been in the office as a full-time worker. So I haven't experienced a lot of the traditionally googly perks that they talk about, like, the kitchen stocked with everything, and cafeteria and all that. But hopefully one day. So I'm looking forward to that. But otherwise, the benefits are all still available to me as a software engineer, and some of the benefits are pretty incredible in terms of what they offer, even compared to like other big software companies. So that's hard to beat, I would say.
What's your favorite one?
I
know it's difficult.
Ooh, yeah.
And what you think?
Come back to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jeremy, how about you? What was your favorite one?
Oh man, there were so many good things. Like, the classic one is the food, and I'm a little bit of a foodie, so I liked trying, when I would go to a different office, like trying their cafe and see what spin they put on it. Just about every Google office has a cafe, and each one has something a little bit different than the others. The main campus has a ton of different cafes. Probably right now is like no one's using them. But when I was there, that was always fun. I don't know if that was my favorite thing, though. This is going to sound maybe a little cliche, but I think my favorite, and it's not like an official perk, but I worked with so many like really, really brilliant people, and I learned a lot from the experience. So I joke, I never graduated college. So my computer science education was almost entirely 7 years of Google. Like I was a coder before then, and I tinkered with stuff, but talking to people who are PhDs or more who worked on things like compilers and or like advanced math and other stuff, and just talking to them at lunch, that was probably my favorite perk. Like just the sheer amount of information I was able to absorb there.
Okay.
Yeah, and going off of that, I know I mentioned benefits, but I think Jeremy's answer kind of reminded me that probably my favorite part is like being involved with the non-work related groups at Google, just because there's like so many people working there, engineers or not, and like, you know, really for any kind of hobby group or any activity that you might be interested in or involved in, like there's a group you can find at Google that's already doing that, whether it's like a video game, you know, a group of people who play the same game, or like Ultimate Frisbee. I'm big into Ultimate Frisbee, and there's already, you know, huge community of people who play Frisbee at Google, and just being able to connect in that route, like as a musician, you know, finding the music community at Google, like it's all there, and it's so cool.
Damn. That sounds really good, and that's one of my favorite things to look for as soon as I start as a developer at a new company too. So I heard that your hours are very flexible. I heard they're not very rigid, and people will have a slightly different schedule when they come into the office. Is that true?
It was certainly true when I was there. I also saw it, like different offices had different cultures. I was based in the Chicago office, and we were a little more 9 to 5 than most of the other offices. I think the Chicago office at the time employed a lot more people who had families and kids at home, and so we tended to sort of leave roughly like in between 5 or 6. And then we tended to get there around 9 or 10, but they are pretty flexible. At the time, they didn't really have they didn't allow very many people to work fully remote. I knew of a few people who were fully remote, but that wasn't really a thing. They liked you to be in the office. But even then, like for days, I would just like let my team know, hey, I'm going to work from my house today because I have like some errands I need to run or whatever. And no one would even blink. And it showed up at 10 a.m. instead of 9 a.m. Like no one even noticed. It was really like they weren't tracking your hours or anything like that. All they really cared about was, were you producing what you needed to produce as a part of your job?
Okay.
Yeah. Again, pretty different for me in terms of, you know, entirely remote for everybody now. So it's kind of difficult to, you know, get a sense of everybody's working hours / like, you know, work-life balance and all that. But in terms of activity online, you know, from what I can tell, like the work-life balance is pretty good. And I never feel pressured in any way to work less or more. It's really just kind of up to me. I think it's particularly interesting for me working in Central Time with a team that's entirely based in Pacific Time. Well, myself and one other East Coaster, the two of us are the only exceptions to the rest of the team who are entirely Pacific Time. And even that, you know, really hasn't, for the most part, hasn't really come up at all. You know, we just like, I work mostly 9 to 5 or try to like every day, and like that 2-hour offset with Pacific Time, you know, not really a big deal. Yeah, I think it's pretty flexible. And, you know, of course the expectation differs from manager to manager, but my manager is very clear about, you know, like take care of everything, you know, that you need to do at home. Like if you need to, you know, take some time to do whatever at your house for your family, whatever, for any reason, you know, you can just do that. So that's really nice to know.
Sounds like work-life balance, and maybe it depends on the manager, but it sounds like both of you had a good work-life balance if you wanted it.
Yeah, I would say that.
Well, definitely. Yeah. And I think it does, like, it depends on manager a little bit. Every manager is going to be a little different. I have really good managers at Google, and I learned a lot about managing teams at Google from those people, which I'm now using as I do some of that in my current day-to-day. So
that's good. That's really good to hear. All right, 20%, 80% split. And so this, I actually just found this out, but I found out that 80% of your work is focused on your actual job and what your manager wants you to do, whatever projects you're working on, and 20% is given to you to experiment and kind of explore maybe a personal project or a side project. Can you both elaborate on what that is? Because talking with you earlier, it sounded like that actually was a thing. So I want to hear more about that from you guys.
I'm not sure if they still have it. I'm not aware of it going away, but I had some 20% projects when I was at Google. When I was working on the open source team, 80% of my time, well, the math gets a little fuzzy because 20% projects tend to be passion projects. So in reality, it was more like I worked 100% on my job because that was also kind of a passion project because it was open source. And then I would spend, extra time on top of that on my 20%, but no one cared that I was doing something not directly on my job, which I think is the key point. Like one of my projects was adding Clojure, the Java-based Lisp support to the build tool Blaze, which is now open source as Bazel. I worked on some of the bindings for that, the early bindings for that, because I thought it was interesting and cool and wanted to, and no one thought it was weird. And some places you'll work, like you do something like that, that's sort of looks like it's at least on company time. You're using company property, but it's not strictly your job. They might look at you weird, but not at Google, at least back then anyway.
Yeah, I think for the most part, it stays the same. I guess I would want to emphasize the end of what Jeremy said. I think what's more important is that, the feeling that you get at Google, which is like, it doesn't feel like they're like limiting you or, it's this very encouraging atmosphere of like, yeah, like you want to do something, like go do it, like you want to learn, whatever, like all great. And I think in a workplace in general, like I want to continue to work at places that always do that. I think my previous workplace also felt the same way. And I think 20% project is just a manifestation of that. And I've also heard from some people that a lot of times, like when people do have 20% projects, like they tend to become 120% projects. But again, it seems like that's something that they're interested in, and definitely something I'm interested in. I'll be pursuing a 20% project soon myself. So we'll kind of see how that goes. But yeah, definitely still around.
Interesting. I really like that. I've worked at a company that promised that didn't deliver. So it's really good to see Google taking that seriously. And I don't know about you guys, but I feel like sometimes I do get stuck on projects I don't want to work with. And it's unfortunate. And of course, I'm going to put my full effort into it. But I feel like, and it's a really weird feeling, but if I just do my 9 to 5 on that project that I don't really want to work with, and then go home and then relax, I tend to get burned out on coding. And it's not until I actually put extra hours into working on something I really do want to learn, something that I do want to work on, where even if I put that extra time into it, I don't feel burned out anymore. Does that sound pretty true? Is that your experience at all? Or is that kind of just my own unique experience?
Yeah, I think I would feel the same way. I have a pretty special connection to like personal project and side projects because I didn't major in computer science in college. Like I didn't come the traditional CS major to software engineer, that kind of route. And so my gateway, so to speak, was a side project that I did on top of my coursework in college. And that was like how I taught myself like all the software engineering basics. And really that's one of the most fulfilling experiences I've had in college, maybe ever. Just like building an app that like I personally wanted to build for no other reason than like, I just want to learn and do this. And that turned into an app that most of my university ended up using. And so like, being able to do something like that and also at the same time tied into your career skill is, I think, really important way to keep yourself from being burnt out, keep yourself from, losing interest. That's always how it's been for me, at least.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, my like I think I mentioned when we were first getting started here that I code in my free time to relax. Because currently I don't code a lot on the job. I do a lot of sort of like design discussion and stuff, and I have other people code, pair with them, try to level them up, that sort of thing. But I don't do a lot of my own, and um, I've found over the years that like writing some software is one of the ways that I learn a new topic or a new concept. And so like I have to kind of get my hands in it a little bit, and coding is a good way to focus. But also just there's something about the creative act of writing code that is, I don't know, rejuvenating mentally. And the more creative it is, the more rejuvenating it is. So there's like, sometimes the job is, glue this thing to that thing and it looks a little ugly, but ship it because, the feature needs to be in production before next week. And that's not creative. There's creative stuff at the job, but not all of it is. And if you're stuck in that sort of non-creative glue thing to other thing, cross your fingers and hope type stuff, right? That's not terribly rejuvenating, or that doesn't give you a feeling of accomplishment all the time. And so those opportunities to exercise creative direction, creative thought, I think are important.
Okay. Interesting. All right. I really want to get both of your perspectives on it. Selfishly, I just personally want to know that. So thank you. So have either of you worked at a startup before?
Yeah, I haven't particularly worked on a specific startup-sized company.
Okay.
You could say that when I was at Grubhub, which is my past company, they were kind of transitioning away from being a startup. They were still very much in some ways felt like a startup, but not specifically, no.
Okay.
I tried to start a company once.
How'd that go?
It didn't go very well. It went really badly, actually. We didn't have a person who could do sales, and that's kind of important. You need someone to buy, and we didn't have that someone who could like get people to buy, even if we were fair, at the work of doing technical stuff, coding, provisioning servers, that sort of thing. So that failed. So in a way, I suppose I have a very small amount of experience as a startup founder, but I don't know that it's very applicable because it was very short-lived and didn't work out very well.
Have either of you worked at a company with less than 100 employees?
No.
Yeah. The place before here, I think initially when I joined was less than 100 employees. It wasn't really a startup, although the software engineering division at that company was very new. So it sort of felt kind of startup-like in that sense. But.
Okay. Well, so, all right. I wanted to kind of get your definition of what a startup is to both of you, and I think I have it. So let me rephrase the question, I guess, that I was going to ask. Compared to a company that's much smaller than Google, and I think Grubhub is smaller than Google in terms of how many employees, right?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. So what would be a few differences that you've noticed working at Google compared to a much smaller company as a software engineer?
This is an interesting question. Google has a lot of money, which means that Google, at least, especially when I was there, and I think probably to a certain extent still does, doesn't have to push a feature, doesn't have to cut any engineering corners because they have enough money to float. Most other companies don't have that. Like where I'm at currently doesn't have that. There's like there's a need to get certain things out the door by a certain time, and then you'll do your best to like clean up afterwards. And you're doing very iterative, but you're doing it sort of live. At Google, you had the luxury. I worked on a project for 6 months that never didn't touch production the whole time, and then it launched. But Google could afford to pay me for 6 months to do it, and when it launched, there were billions of people exercising my code every second, which is a weird feeling. It's sort of staggering to think that like if you have a billion people every second executing your code, some of those people are finding a bug you missed. It's inevitable. There's no way to avoid it. And so the first time you do that, you're sitting there going like a little bit queasy, imagining that many people running your code and thinking, like, how many people did I annoy or make slightly worse today? Like their day just a little bit worse because of something in my code that is running right now. And that's weird.
Yeah, but how many people did you make their lives better because of your code?
Hopefully a lot more than I made worse.
I'm sure you did.
But it's difficult to know, right? Like Google has a lot of metrics. They track a lot of things. And so, fairly quickly if you're rolling out a feature, if it's having some kind of an adverse impact, and they'll roll it back and let you know. And failure is just considered like normal. They're like, yeah, like we have so many people running our code. Of course you're going to run into these sorts of things. So I had my code rolled back 3 times while we were trying to get it to production and had to fix various different things that I didn't know about. That doesn't happen at a lot of smaller companies in the same way because there's less people hitting it. And you're the expectation is you're going to roll it out. You're going to roll out a fix. You're going to roll out another fix. And at Google, we're going to roll it back. You're going to add a fix. We're going to push it back out again. And then we're going to roll it back because we found the next thing, right? Which is a slightly different way of working, but Google can afford it because they have so much money. And it's when you leave Google, it's a little bit of a wake-up call that you don't have some of those luxuries anymore.
Yeah, and I guess to kind of bounce off of that, it really speaks to the investment they're making in the infrastructure, right? And not only the infrastructure and tooling, but the process behind all of that. And a lot of companies tend to be focused on generating revenue as companies are, right? And like they need to get product out there and features out there so they get more users and they get more revenue. And a lot of the times the work that you do as a software engineer can often be tied to features, products, users, right? And like really things that will generate revenue. And if you're not working on those things at that company, then you can kind of feel like you're understaffed or undersupported. But at Google, everything is, it would be false for me to say everything is well staffed, but like everything is like at least supported. And it feels like the infrastructure is so well built because it's just been, used by literally tens of thousands of developers, right? Like all the time for years. And, they've built it up to the point where the tooling is solid, the infrastructure is there. And like, on top of that, they built this set of best practices and procedures and knowledge that, you as a developer diving into Google can just soak up like whenever you want, right? And like, whether it's about like testing or how to write clean code or, how to release features correctly, like all these things that some companies that are smaller might either struggle with or like have to learn from other sources. Like at Google, it's been done, it's documented, like you just follow the rules, right? And like, it's really refreshing. And it's nice to like, instead of having to go to a meeting and be like, all right, what's the cleanest way we can design this? It's more that like, hey, like, here's this website, internal website tells you like, here's a recommendation, like how to do X, Y, Z, and you just follow it. And And it's, of course, there's not to say that there aren't discussions on like how to implement things correctly or design, because there are plenty of that. But for the most part, I think really just at a big picture, high level, everything's kind of, you look for an answer for the most part, like you're just going to be able to find it because somebody's already done it for you. And that investment of Google, having the money to invest engineers in things that are not related to features, things that are more developer focused, things that are more platform focused, like it does make a big difference.
Yeah, it sounds like that structure, especially if you've worked in an environment that didn't have all that internal tooling before, and they didn't have to answer as many questions because they've already been asked, already been answered. It sounds convenient. It almost sounds like you said, I don't know what you said, refreshing or a breath of fresh air. It would be different. It'd be very different. I think one concern I would have is the autonomy or the ability to get creative with my implementations. Do you feel like we're actually, well, maybe I can combine it with this next question. No, I think it's a separate question. Do you feel like that was ever a strain on you as a developer in feeling impactful in the work? Do you feel like there were points where you didn't have the autonomy that you were hoping for to fulfill you as a developer?
Not personally. I mean, impact wise, like, I just today, like I was working on Gmail and Google Chat, like those are products that literally are used by billions of people. So I guess impact is not something I really worry about. I'm definitely fortunate enough to be able to say that. In terms of independence, though, I see where you're coming from. Like, obviously, you don't want to, as a software engineer, be boxed into this set of just following a set of recipes. And I think what's nice about software, no matter where you practice it, no matter what company, is that there's always multiple ways to do something, right? And like there's, all designs are just trade-offs. I feel like you hear that ad nauseum in preparing for a design interview, but it really is true. Like all designs are trade-offs, and there's still plenty of discussions at Google, on like how to implement a feature, how to design a feature, and what trade-offs are the right ones to make. It's just that when you step back a little bit higher level and you kind of have to start having questions about what's been done, or like what's the right formula to do this specific thing, like the resources are usually there for you and it's kind of laid out for you.
I would actually maybe phrase it this way. Google removes a lot of friction for the developer. There's a lot of things that aren't like, they're not really a component of creative freedom. Like how do I deploy this? Right? How do I make this run in Google's structure? It's done for you. Like there's one way. Everyone deploys the same way, and it's not interesting. The interesting stuff is, what algorithm do I use here? Or what's the best way to solve this particular problem? Like one of the projects that I took on was writing a CSS compiler that integrated tightly with a template engine, which integrated tightly with a web server, and there were a lot of synergies. And that was interesting work. But I didn't have to worry about how to build it, how to deploy it, how to do any of those things. My creativity was really focused on the problem I was trying to solve. And if you were interested in exercising creativity in the how to deploy things, then there were I knew of at least 5 different ways to deploy experiments happening around me that I wasn't paying any attention to because they weren't of concern. Some of them became the next generation of how to do deployments. And some of them, I'm sure, became Kubernetes in the end, right? That Kubernetes is an evolution of how Google did infrastructure. So it really depended on what problem you wanted to focus on. And whichever one you were going to focus on, everything else was handled for you. There was a well-known, understood standard way to store your data, to deploy your thing, to get space in Google's domains and paths to do routing at. All that stuff was there was a way to do it. And if you cared about the way it happened, then you could take part maybe as your 20% on that team and help evolve that infrastructure and exercise creativity there. But if you didn't care, then it was handled for you and you didn't have to care. And I think that's part of what makes Google free when you're working there, is you're free to think about the specific problem you care about, not the 100 other problems that every software engineer is aware of when they're like, okay, I wrote this cool thing, but now how do I run it? How do I get it deployed? How do I make sure it stays up? How do I monitor it? Like all these other things, it's all handled for you at Google. If you're working where I am right now, it's maybe 50% handled for you, and there's still lots of questions, and most engineers don't care about those questions. They would rather just hand it off.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good way to put it. I agree with that. I think, if there wasn't, right, like a way to exercise creativity, and if there wasn't a wealth of interesting problems still to solve, like engineers would be at Google, obviously. And I think, being able to focus on the things that you like, letting the engineer get to the problems that they care about is a strong suit here. And especially in the small cases where your tooling doesn't serve you well enough, or like some things come up outside of your usual focus pipeline that you want to get to, it doesn't seem, it feels like you're free to kind of reach out on your own in that regard too. Like if I'm, for the most part, I'm focused on like, how do I implement this UI feature so that, XYZ requirements are met, right? Like that's my day-to-day problem solving process. But like maybe in the process of doing that, I'll run into a question like, oh, this templating language we use like doesn't allow me to do this as nicely as some other templating language I might know. Then I might step back and like reach out to the relevant people who work on that templating language, and I can have like a discussion about the literal authors of that templating language who are my coworkers, right? Because it's like all done in-house. So, and like I can get a good idea of like, hey, like when is this new feature coming out to help me out? Like it's all, it's all there, and definitely available for you to tackle as you see fit.
Go ahead, Jeremy.
I was just going to say, like, one of the secrets to that being possible at Google, I think, is the fact that all the code's in one giant code base.
Absolutely.
And like, there's a lot of debate online about like, are monorepos a good thing or a bad thing? But at Google, one thing they enabled was, if I wanted to see how something worked, it was in the same repository as my code. If I wanted to modify how something worked, it was in this repository as my code. And if I was consuming something, an API, say, and the developers of that API wanted to solve a problem, they weren't blocked by me, because they could go into my code base and upgrade me without me having to worry about it. So having it all in one single code base that was like easily available to everyone gave a lot of freedom for the people to focus on the things they cared about, while somebody else was focusing on the things they didn't care about, like keeping you updated to the latest version, coordinating with you if it was such a breaking change that it had drastic impacts on your system. Like they built tooling to manage repository-wide changes. There were people whose job was to take API X and upgrade it everywhere in a code base that was billions of lines. And they wrote tools to help them do that. Like that's how much Google invests in the tooling. That thing you think would never be worth doing, Google did because their scale made it worth it for them to do it.
A lot to process there. Really, really interesting stuff. I have a lot of comments and opinions about that, but just for time's sake, I want to focus on a couple things that you guys just mentioned. So my concern was autonomy. Especially, there are a lot of software engineers that appreciate that autonomy, and they appreciate, and where do I want to go with this? So it sounds like even with a large company like Google, that autonomy exists because you can even just lean on that 20% time to explore new things. But it sounds like a lot of the problems, like when I talk about autonomy, I mean, you guys are right. There are a lot of problems that I don't want to have to solve again. It's the whole point of bringing in a lot of libraries that I have brought in. And it sounds like it's more of a convenience than it is a hindrance for developers being creative. It sounds like there are going to probably be forced conventions, but you get that at any company. But it sounds like there are opportunities to get a little bit creative, to explore something and not necessarily get stuck in a certain type of project that you're working on. Because Google has so many other opportunities. You have one giant code base. And like you said, you don't even have to get stuck because it's not your area. It's all one giant code base, and you have a process to be able to, if they are overbooked, to kind of get unstuck by diving into someone else's code potentially. And you guys also mentioned the idea of like impact. I think another concern is if I'm working at Google, I'm another cog in the wheel. And what I do touches a very small portion of the code base. But I think it's also important to, and it sounds like you can kind of expand that and extend that into other areas, and Google gives you those opportunities. So that's good to hear. But you can also look at impact as in, yeah, maybe I'm not building out a giant feature, within a two-week sprint, but I'm still impacting, millions of people with my feature. And that's just acknowledging fulfillment and impact in a different way. So this is all interesting. I'm kind of just like processing this as I'm talking out loud. This is really cool. It is.
Yeah. I think everyone, people want impact in different ways, right? Like some people measure the impact by how many people are using what I built. Other people measure impact by whether a single person's life was made better as a result. When I was at Google, I really enjoyed working on tools that other developers used. I liked building something that made another developer really productive and fast, which I guess is a cheeky way of saying I worked on things that allowed me to multiply my effort and the impact across a whole bunch of different other people because I was taking part in all of their impact. But Google gives you all kinds of opportunities. I think it's still in the Chicago office, but the takeout team, take all your data from Google, download it, take it away. That team was there, and their impact was measured in a very different way because most people don't go and download all their data from Google. But it kept Google honest for a long time, and maybe still does, where by keeping this escape hatch open, anyone could leave and take everything that they maybe cared about, which means that we had to do certain things, and that's why that team was formed. So Google has lots of different opportunities for impact. I think because it's so large and because it does so many things, if you're interested in making an impact in a particular way, Google probably has a way for you to do that somewhere. June mentioned there's so many different interest groups, and that's very true, right? And so if you want to make an impact in some other social way, I used to go with a bunch of other Googlers to help teach middle schoolers computer science in the schools. Another way for me to make an impact in a different way than just code. So when you're working at an organization that large, the number of opportunities and that open, internally, Google's pretty transparent. So you're able to be aware of and participate in a lot of things, and no one's going to tell you, no, you can't do that for the most part. which gives you a lot more opportunity than you might otherwise have.
That's true. I think that's a really good point. Okay. So one other thing that I wanted to dive into was the interview process. But before we do that, I have a selfish question. So first of all, I didn't do my intro because I think most of my viewers know me by now. But I was a software engineer for a few years, and I started my own company to help software engineers become software engineers. It's what I love doing. And I do it because I almost gave up. I know a lot of people that give up as a software engineer when it can be very fulfilling. And I know how much of an impact a software engineer can make in the world. And so my entire business revolves around. And I was always concerned, and I always read contracts very strictly when I would join all my companies. Can I build something outside of work hours, without work resources, and keep that? Or would my company take that away from me? Would they own it when I left? Are you aware of anything in the contracts that allowed you to kind of, work on something that was fulfilling outside of work, that wasn't in competition with Google? And would you be able to even just start your own company with an app that ended up being really successful?
I think everything, with these kinds of things, like everything depends on the situation. But for the most part, it's not as restrictive as one might think. I'm definitely not going on record to say like I am the end all be all for Google Legal, but to my knowledge, I am not forbidden from, working on side projects, doing personal stuff. I can contribute to open source in my own time, as long as it, I'm doing it with my own resources. I can, I think with some exceptions of like being competitors to Google and things like that, I could even own a business if I wanted to.
Okay.
When I was there, that was pretty much true, with the caveat that Google does so many things that it's actually kind of hard to find something you're not competing with them with. I will give this Google June, you could maybe tell me if this is still the case, but Google had a defined process for letting them know ahead of time you were thinking about doing something, and they would tell you whether or not they would consider that to be in competition, and give you like a, hey, we're disclaiming ownership of this explicitly to you right now. There was a whole process that you could kick off if that was something you wanted to do, and get like legal certainty at that time, as opposed to legal uncertainty at most places where there's no defined process for asking, hey, if I do this, are you guys going to come after me later? Google had a way for you to like answer that question before you even started. In the case of open source, it's even more explicit. Like there's a very well-defined process for contributing to open source, and that makes sure that you are entirely legally safe while doing so. I don't really have for-profit type side projects. All my side projects, even at that time, were pretty much just open source type things. And so I used that the open source process frequently when I was at Google, to explicitly disclaim, their copyright over that code that I was contributing, unless it was something that I was doing under the auspices of Google, in which case Google would own the copyright, but I would be contributing on their behalf. So, but I always knew exactly what my legal standing was in any of those cases, unless I didn't follow the process, in which case that's sort of on me. They gave me a way to get legal certainty, and I just didn't take advantage of it if that were the case.
Okay. That's really interesting. I love the idea of that process existing. I had no idea. Okay. I appreciate that. I know both of you aren't legal, like you're software engineers, you're managers of software engineers, but I appreciate kind of that, your perspective on that, because that's always been one big thing that's ever held me from actually putting in the time to study and prepare for an interview process with a larger company. It always put me off because I'm an entrepreneur at heart. I'm like, well, I could see myself working here for 5 years, but 20. And so I always think ahead. And I know it's interesting because as I do more videos like this, I learned there are a lot of software engineers that very well might start their own company one day. And so I like to get information about that. So cool. All right. Last thing, how much time do we have? What was the interview process like for you?
So I'm probably a bad person to ask a question. I came in by an acquisition. So I didn't technically interview at Google at all. However, I did a lot of interviews at Google. Like I conducted them. Mm-hmm. So I can talk about like from that perspective, maybe. They are grueling. Google, you do a lot of interviews. There's a lot of sessions. It's an all-day process. And so like I don't look down at anyone who's like, I just don't want to have to go through that, because it's an extensive process to interview at Google, or at least it was. I'm assuming it still is.
Yeah, I think my interview process kind of met that bar. I would say, there are many other companies at this point, especially of larger sizes, that also have all-day interviews, and how grueling they are may depend on your preference of being in an interview. But definitely the bar felt higher, I would say, at Google than most other places. Like the kind of questions I got, or maybe not even the kind of questions I got, but like the way the engineers kind of led the discussion, and it was clear that they were looking for very specific things, and it seemed like maybe difficulty-wise, but in general, like the bar did feel a little bit higher.
So you mentioned they were looking for very specific things. Did you find that the questions were general enough for you to be considered for another team if you're already in the middle of the interview process and they figured maybe you're not a good fit for the team they're currently interviewing for?
Yeah, so I should probably clarify. There's obviously like cases where you're interviewing for a specific position at Google, but I wasn't one of those. So a lot of like college recruits will do this, but I was similar to a college recruit in that I'd only been out of college for a few years, and depending on kind of what level you are, you could be part of this group, meaning you just interview for the company as a whole as a software engineer. And they kind of, they'll kind of tell you beforehand, like looking at your resume and stuff, like what they expect you, like what level they expect kind of you to go in for. But it really is just like, if you're part of that cohort, you'll just be interviewed as a software engineer, not for a specific position. One of the nice things is that they make that very clear, and they also talk to you about the team matching process, which comes after the infamous Google hiring committee. So it's definitely a little bit different than like, if you were to apply for a specific position at some other company that you kind of know. So for me was phone interview, or I would have done a phone interview. I actually had that skipped. And then they asked me to do an on-site, which at that point was remote because they just had started going work from home. So it was an all-day remote interview, quote unquote on-site. And then after that, you get put through the hiring committee, which, you just wait for that. You don't do anything on your part. And then if you pass the hiring committee, then you start doing team matching interviews. So you just talk to some managers who have open spots in your team. And then if you find one, then you've got a job at Google.
What makes the hiring committee infamous?
I feel like this is the step that is that people always talk about, at least for me, when I was doing research, try to get into Google, like this was a step that a lot of people online were talking about. And just probably the fact that they have such a formalized committee process for it, as opposed to other companies who I'm sure also have formalized processes, but aren't as, well known by name. But it is rigorous. And I'm sure Jeremy could speak to a lot more details on from the other side, but it definitely is very rigorous and kind of codified. That's where.
Yeah. The hiring committee are the people who say hire or no hire. The interviews don't. The people who do the interviews don't actually get to make that decision at all. They just assign a score, essentially. In fact, at the time when I was doing it, it's a numeric score. And then back up the score with a bunch of data. I actually had people on the hiring community come back to me and say, you gave them this score, but you didn't give enough supporting, so I don't know how to interpret that score. So they look very closely at like what the interview feedback was, why the person justifies that score. And they go like, I was never on a hiring committee, but it looked to me like it was a large job. They would go off for like a day and go through a whole bunch of interviews and like go thumbs up, thumbs down on them. I think they're sort of infamous because it's not a very transparent group necessarily. Like you're an interviewer, you're doing interviews, you're an interviewee and you're being interviewed. And then all of this goes off somewhere and neither of those two people like knows exactly what the impact of the interview was, right? Like even for the interviewer, their feedback went into this mysterious group over here who then goes, hey, this person you should hire, this person you didn't. And part of their job, because there's so many interviews happening, like you're almost guaranteed that some of those interviewers are gonna give a bad score.
Interesting.
So like determining like was that just an interview fail, or is that bad score a real problem for this candidate? And they're weighing those kinds of things. You're going to have other people who are like gave an amazing score for that candidate, and they're trying to figure out like, is that amazing score actually justified, or was it just that they happen to know exactly the one weird trick for that one interview or question or whatever it was. So they're weighing all those things, and because they didn't do the interview, all they have to go off is that score and that written interview feedback, and so it eliminates a certain amount of bias from the person who's like, I just like the guy, so I give him a big score, right? I don't know. I'm not an expert on hiring, but it did seem like we hired a lot of really smart people. I was always worried that I wouldn't be able to pass the interview if I interviewed at Google.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are. So, okay, that's really interesting. And because I've heard stories of, I mean, you're always going to get this from some applicants, like they felt the interviewer was biased, they weren't helpful enough in the challenges, or like, I don't know, everyone has their own opinions, but I have also heard really good things that kind of match what you said, Jeremy, about how they do have a process to really try to make it as unbiased as possible. And I really do believe that from everything that I've heard. So what advice would you give to people that are going through the interview process or considering Google? Let's consider two things. Maybe the advice could be about what should their experience be before they apply to Google, or if that's not as relevant, how should they prepare for the interview process? What mindset should they go into it with? So what would be your advice for that?
Good question.
Like I said, they had no preparation for this whatsoever. So please take your time, as much time as you need.
I think yeah, sure. I think interview processes in general, I mean, like, I talk to a lot of my friends about this because I have a lot of software engineering friends, go figure. And like, I think it always comes up, the fact that like, no matter, where you are, where you're going, like how well you prepare, like to some extent, it's really a crapshoot, right? Like, and, I think from my personal experience with Google and a few other large companies, like the process seems good, and the process seems well designed to kind of, at their best interest, judge your ability to perform it and do well and other things that they need to know. But even on top of all that, right, there's just so many variables, and like it really comes down to anything like, are you having a good day? Like, did that interviewer, like forget to, I don't know, like fix that bug that morning and they're like really in a rush or something? Like, did the interviewer click with you more than others? Like, it's just so many things that like are human aspects of it, especially, that I think are hard to control. So to any candidates, I would first and foremost like remind them, like, yeah, like you should prepare, you should do all the things that, people tell you online and kind of the books kind of outline for you and study up and all that. But in the end, like there are just some things that you just can't control, and ultimately it's a numbers game. So, I wouldn't take failure or, bad feedback as like as such a strong setback. I mean, it's, Google or not, I would say it's more important to just focus on improving yourself and just, keep trying and finding the thing that really clicks for you, whether it's a position or a team or a manager or whatever.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think that like much preparing for a Google interview, I don't think is substantially different than preparing for an interview someplace else.
Really?
Like you're going to have a range of different types of interviewers, because you're going to interview a lot of people are going to interview you at Google. So you're going to have the guy who wants to like test out your algorithm knowledge, right? Like, can you do big O or something like that, right? You'll have one of those. You'll have another person who's like a whiz at a particular language, and he may see if he can test your knowledge there. There's other people who just like, can the guy code or not? Like, can he like put together an if statement and a loop and come up with something sane from the other end? You're gonna have the range of people. I think the thing to remember is the mental. If say you start your first interview session at Google and you come out of it rattled and you're like, I bombed. You've got 4 more or something like that, right? Like you've got a bunch more. One bad interview session isn't going to sink you necessarily. The reason they do so many is so that one bad interview session can't sink you. That's why you're interviewing all day. So take a deep breath, go on to the next one, prepared. It's going to be a different kind of question, a different kind of thing. And so like, don't let those rattle you too much when you feel like you did a bad job, because you've got another chance to just knock it out of the park the next session. And when you interview that many times, you're almost guaranteed for someone to ask you a question that is like not up your alley. Unless you're, like the legendary Jeff Dean, in which case maybe all the questions are up your alley, but you're probably not the legendary Jeff Dean. So in which case, like, there will be someone who's going to ask you like a nitty gritty TCP protocol question, and you're like, I have no idea, because that's not my thing. I don't do that. And then you just, go past it. Don't sweat it. I think that's the key. If you let it rattle you, then you're going to be distracted the next time you interview, or you're going to be worried, and you're just not mentally going to be all there. So I think that's maybe the most important thing. And then, like, brush up on your algorithms before you go. Brush up on the top 3 program. Well, I guess it's maybe top 4 now at Google. Java, C++, JavaScript, and I guess Go is in there now. So, like, make sure you can do something in at least one of those is probably a good idea. You might get some candidates who are like, sure, I know that other language that go ahead and give me that problem in that one. It depends, but be prepared to like meet the interviewer where they currently are. So like with one of those languages is probably a good idea. But the biggest thing is just don't let one bad interview session rattle you, because it's not the end of the world.
Both of you are very encouraging. But go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to emphasize like what Jeremy said about, I think studying for a Google interview doesn't really seem, at least in my opinion, like doesn't particularly seem any different than studying for any other interview. And there's
one small difference. Google is not going to ask you a question about a framework or something that you're familiar with, because they probably don't use it. They're not going to ask you a MySQL question because they do run MySQL, but it's not recognizable as MySQL. So like stick to the code, the algorithms, those kinds of
fundamentals.
So, the fundamentals is what they're going to ask you about. They're not going to ask you about like React Redux or anything like that, or at least not likely to, because they're not using React and Redux probably. They're using something different internally that you've never heard of and you'll learn about in your 6 months.
It's a good point.
Like I said, both of you are very encouraging with this. And I like that last bit, focus on the fundamentals. And you reemphasize, and I forgot about this. You even mentioned it earlier, like Google has all their own software, all their own frameworks. And I think it was really good to emphasize, like really brush up on algorithms and your fundamentals. Now, the only part that I don't necessarily agree with, and maybe you're thinking this because you've already gotten into Google and you have a lot of experience, because as I've talked to many software engineers that have interviewed at Google and have failed out of that interview process, I have a hard time believing it's the same type of challenge. You're going to do the same type of preparation that you would at any other company. And when I've looked at some of those problems, they're much more advanced than I've ever been tested at, and that many software engineers have ever been tested at. And so do you honestly think, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm just like viewing it the wrong way, do you honestly think that because like the big thing is the algorithm, everyone panics about the algorithm challenges. Do you feel like the difficulty of the challenges at Google actually do mirror smaller companies and other companies?
I think it really depends on how you think of that, like mentally. Because I have a pretty unique approach or experience, I would say, just because again I didn't have a CS major from college. Like I wasn't able to take the algorithms courses, the advanced CS courses that all my friends who were doing software took. So when I first interviewed for jobs outside of college, like I felt pretty behind. I didn't get all the fancy interviews at Google, Microsoft, whatever that my friends did. And I had recently switched. By the time I graduated, I just recently switched to deciding to do software as a career. So I really felt behind in a lot of ways. And I remember the very first software engineer interview I ever got was with Google. And I bombed it. Like it was so bad. Like I hadn't studied that much. Like I didn't really know what it was like to go one-on-one with an engineer and talk through a problem. Like, and it was a humbling experience. Like here's this dream company that wanted to interview me, and I go in there and it was terrible. And many years later, I came back and was much more prepared and kind of was able to go through that process a lot more on my own terms. And it wasn't because, I studied harder for Google or I studied extra algorithms like on top of what I missed out in college. Like it wasn't because of any of that. I think it was just because, it was the right time for me to look for a new job. And I was really I kind of knew what I was looking for specifically in my next role. And I wanted to be as prepared for that role as I could in terms of fundamentals, in terms of, really anything. So it wasn't that I was specifically gunning for this Google job. I interviewed in the same round with a few other companies as well. And some of them had very tough questions too. But I think, if you do see that like Google interview questions are more tough compared to other questions, like, sure, you're probably not wrong, but I don't think that should change your approach on how you should prepare and how you should approach it. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Okay. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll say this. Google's process biases toward false negatives because they view a false positive as so dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
So failing a Google interview doesn't say a lot about you necessarily, right? Like, you may be an outstanding engineer, just even though you failed. Like, in fact, we know, like, I know of outstanding interviewers or engineers who have failed a Google interview. And it doesn't mean they're bad engineers or anything like that. It just means that, like, Google is very, very cautious in their hiring. And it shows internally, like, the number of false positives is very low. They still exist, but it's really, like, sort of hard to find them, and they don't last very long typically, I don't think. So in some sense, it's like, don't beat yourself up if you fail the Google interview. Don't stress out if you have a bad session during the interview, because it's going to hurt your chances later. And Google is going to ask, like, challenging, thought-provoking problems. It's true. But even if you're not familiar with the algorithm, if you are willing to try and talk through it with the interviewer, like, most of the people I knew who did interviews looked at that and said, this is good. This guy was able to learn what he needed to in that interview and pick it up and figure it out. Even if he didn't finish the problem, like, he was on the right track, and someone who already knew the secret trick, right, would have done it. But they get high marks sometimes for that. Now, Google's a very large company. There's a lot of people doing interviews. Not everyone is, there are people who are just like that kind of interview, or that. I hate trick questions. I never use them in my interviews. Like, I really just want to ask a question that allows someone to, like, arrive at the correct answer just using their, like, knowing how to code and no prior knowledge. And that can grow from there. And many of the people I interviewed, like, who were interviewers alongside me, used the same approach when I was at Google. But I knew people who asked, like, the really weird, trick, esoteric questions that would, like, challenge most engineers to figure out. In my experience at the time, again, 7 years ago, like, they were rare. And we were generally looking for people who demonstrated the ability to pick it up if they didn't already know it. And we tried to ask questions that you could pick up if you didn't get too rattled, if you weren't, like, stressing about the previous bad interview, something like that, right? Like, so I think a lot of it is just, like, are you mentally prepared for an interview like at Google? And it's partly just psyching yourself up, partly ensuring that you're not going to get like, disappointed or easily rattled. And if you're the kind of person who does, then you're going to struggle. But if you're the kind of person who doesn't get easily rattled, then you'll probably give a decent showing for yourself.
I love the approach both of you had towards tackling a Google interview. And I think part of it, more of it, I was expecting something different. And I think more of your approach is focusing on an encouraging mindset and focusing on what you can do right rather than what you potentially can fail. And you also emphasized that you should be approaching the Google interview the same way that you approach any other company. But maybe that just means like really holding yourself accountable for how you prepare for every single one of your interviews. And there's a lot more I want to say, but I think I don't have time because we have like 2 minutes left and I want to give you your time back. But one thing I want to kind of just follow up with is I think you changed my perspective on a larger company like Google, because I was very skeptic. Because like I said, I'm just a very skeptic person and I like challenging things, because I do think everyone should go in with a really, really informed decision. And I think many people are very good salesmen and they can convince you something exists in a way where it really doesn't. And I really encourage people to ask as many questions and challenge things as much as they can. But yeah, you shifted my perspective on Google for the better. So I really appreciate that. It's time for outros. So we'll actually start from left to right on my screen. It'll be Jeremy, me, and June. Jeremy, you want to go ahead and do an outro? I think you had something to shout out too.
Yeah. Thanks. First of all, thanks for having me on. I enjoyed the discussion. It was fun. I'm currently a principal engineer at GoHealth, and we are hiring. You could find me on LinkedIn, and we're basically hiring for everything: software engineers, software engineering data, quality engineers, SREs. So if you like the idea of working with someone like me, maybe reach out.
That sounds great. Thanks, Jeremy. And for me, I'm just going to say, again, I'm starting to say this in all my outros, but keep in mind, this is a video podcast. Some of this listen to the audio, but if you're on YouTube, if you're on any of the audio platforms, subscribe. Let me know what you think of it. I still get feedback every single day. I really, really appreciate it. And it's a good feeling as I grow this kind of small podcast. So continue letting me know what you like, who you want me to interview, and what kind of interviews that you want me to do. Keep in mind, I can't always do coding bootcamp interviews. That seems to be the main thing that people want. There are other really helpful topics towards developers, but that's probably what I'm going to keep doing for a while. But yeah, hopefully you like this big tech interview and kind of what it's like to work at Google. If you do, let me know, because I can do more of these. We can go across the larger companies and interview people at Facebook and other companies. So let me know. All right. How about you, June?
Yeah, I guess, to all the aspiring developers out there, I'm definitely speaking from a similar place, because by the time I was graduating college, I barely just had made the decision to do software. So, you could do it. Just stick with it. And I want to emphasize specifically about Google, kind of like what Jeremy said. The recruiter will tell you too, like many times, like Google does lean for, on the side of false negatives. And really, it does mean that many engineers who are good might quote unquote fail a Google interview. And, I did too. And I think, making sure that doesn't get to you if you fail. The recruiters and all the materials will say, try again. And you really should try again if Google is a place that you're interested in working for. And if not, that's fine too. There's plenty of other software places, big, small, wherever you want to work. There's probably a fit for you. So keep working at it, and yeah, you'll get there.
Very helpful. Very encouraging. Thank you. Jeremy, June, stay on just for a couple minutes afterwards, but I just want to say thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate your experience and your feedback. I think this is going to be a good episode that people appreciate. So thank you.
Thank you, Don.
Yeah, it was a fun time.
Everything we believe, we just see everything we believe, we just see everything we believe, we just see everything.